First of all, thank you to the organizers, all the people involved to making this possible, because this is really a great opportunity for like young scholars, and I'm also very honored to present like in front of young scholars because yeah. Well, actually, the title, the title of my presentation changed a little bit, but because it was before the pandemic, and many things have happened since then. And as Keynes said, like when facts change, sometimes I change my mind. So I changed my mind, and then this, but I feel it is very related. The title is A Post-Keynesian Institutionalist Approach to Markup Inflation in Selected Industrialized Countries, or Can Traditionally Monetary Policy Tame COVID Inflation? What brought me to this paper is the current debate that we are witnessing on the sources of current inflation. But the debate is not so much about the global factors behind inflation, but instead to the domestic inflationary pressures. And we can identify three theories on the table. First, perhaps the new Keynesians that are the most influential because they have many people filling up positions in in policy and in academia, important positions. Then monetaries, that there is a sort of revival of some monetaries that are kind of bringing up this causality in the exchange equation from like money to like the centrality of money growth and all that stuff. And then we have the post-Keynesians, and this paper is on this current of thought. Oh, this school of thought. Okay, so yeah, for new Keynesians such as Fetcher, J. Powell, then Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard, for them, the domestic causes of inflation are that we are in a overheated economy, tight labor markets, and then so in a sense, they are blaming a wage price spiral that is the source of inflation. Then we get the monetaries that they are blaming, governments incurred in like huge deficits in the pandemic, and then we are paying that now. And then we have this expansion of monetary aggregates. And even in Canada, the City Howe Institute has published a paper by Amber and Kronig just very recently, where they advocate the use of money growth rules to conduct monetary policy for the Bank of Canada. And then we have post-Keynesians who say, okay, wait a second. We are not in front of a wage price spiral. Instead, if there is something related to that, to the conflict, then we have a markup or a profit price spiral. And then if we do have that, the consequences for monetary policy will be completely different. And specifically, they point to the increase in monopoly power during the pandemic years and how this fuel the way firms increase markups, and then that impacted inflation. We have some papers, well, Narcisjan and Gray, Servat, Storm, among others. And to start with, well, some post-Keynesians focus on profit, others profit margins, others markups. Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question on the monetary. Do they focus on base raw money growth? Base money,
yes, primarily on base money. Yeah, I mean they have this M1, M2, M3, and they generally use M2 or M3.
It's not base money.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah, bro. Sorry. Yes. I just, yeah. That's it. Okay, sorry. Okay. I was saying some, yeah. And the contribution of this paper is, on the one hand, is to put things clearly in terms of what is markup inflation, and I try to just use the most basic conflict inflation model presentation. And I try to use this model just to see, okay, is markup inflation possible? But because even in the heterodox groups, there are some economists that say, okay, well, we can have some markup inflation, but it will be short-lived. It cannot like last more than probably 1 year. Like it has to be like just very short run. And then I started to think, okay, maybe no, maybe we can still have it for maybe a bit longer. Who knows? Let's look at a model, make sense of it, and then I use another approaches that come from, for example, other post-Keynesians such as Albert Eichner and the structuralist theory of inflation. And also, the second part of the paper is providing some evidence on this markup inflation. If this is the case, if we are in front of markup inflation, then monetary policy tightening, the one that all central banks are carrying out, would be not only highly ineffective to combat inflation, but it could be even counterproductive in the sense that it would either aggravate the conflict between social groups or even widen the disparities in power. And that's my point. At the end, you will see that my point is that the view that inflation is the post-Keynesian view of inflation that is caused by social conflict is right, but it is not so much social conflict. It can also be fueled by the inequalities and disparities in power. So you can have the absence of conflict because there is so much disparities in power that even the class that is being so like pushed or oppressed, it cannot like do something, and then that could also cause inflation. This yeah, that's the first of all, some papers focus on profits or profit margins, other markups. In my case, I decided to focus on markups because they are more related to oligopoly power, as this paper by Consul and Luciani argues. Because on the other hand, we have profits that are more dependent on the economic fluctuations. You have more determinants, and in a way, markups are more stable. And as an aside, yeah, post-Keynesians have never been saying, okay, markup inflation is the whole culprit behind price inflation. No, we have other determinants that are perhaps more important, that are the supply side issues that caused by the global, the pandemic, the Ukraine war things, and all these things. So it's just one factor among others. The first question to ask is, can larger markups generate inflation? Well, from a monetarist perspective, they would say no. As Milton Friedman would say, this inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. New Keynesians would say also no, because in their macro models, usually the markup is micro-founded. It's like it's always defined by the elasticity of substitution between goods, and this is like a parameter given by God, and that doesn't change. So this markup is constant, and it will not change in the long run. And obviously, in the short run, it can vary, but it will vary inversely with the output gap, because the assumption of increasing marginal cost. So there is a markup gap, that is the difference between average markup and desired or target markup. This markup is only the markup that will prevail in the long run, with fully flexible prices. So yeah, you have output this markup gap, but it will change with the output gap, and in the long run, this gap will be closed, will be zero. And then for post-Keynesians, they will say, yes, Why? Because inflation is always and everywhere a distributive phenomenon. And under the assumption of constant unitary cost and idle capacity, then the markup doesn't have to vary with the different levels of economic activity. It is less sensible in a way to this variation. Okay. Yeah.
What if you operate idle capacity and you do have fixed supply side constraints, at least in the short run?
Like for example,
Like for example, with semiconductor chips last year, right? Or which then trickled down, for example, cars. So where would you say?
But would you say that that is that is increasing the like, let's say the capacity utilization of these firms? No, that is not affecting that. That is only perhaps that is increasing their power actually, because some firms are gonna be the ones that will have access first to those chips, for example, and that fact will actually increase their power to fix markups instead of reducing it.
There were actually fixed. There was fixed supply, like car factories that shut down production because there were no chips available. And chip producers are right now extremely expanding their capacity, investing billions into it.
Yeah, but that's why if we later on we will look at the numbers on capacity utilizations to see if it was really let's say an aggregate phenomenon, because okay, some sectors might have these problems, but is that really a problem in terms of the aggregate economy? Let's see.
But I mean, my question was more in this framework, there would not be any scope to have ever-full firms operating at full capacity.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that firms cannot set prices by adding a markup over unit cost or over the direct costs. Yeah, I mean, they could be even at full employment, and why should they like change the way they set their prices? That's the thing. I mean,
Sasha, there's a question here.
Yeah.
Yes, Sasha.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps, yeah, we can discuss that maybe in the question. Yeah, but yeah. Okay. Within the very basic inflation model, we have these two equations. One is the wage inflation, then the price inflation. And then we have the markup. Well, the usual presentation is with the wage rate, but you can always, by picking a wage rate, you automatically are picking a markup rate. So you can present this model in terms of the markup rate. And so that's why it's, it's this Z is the markup rate. And the parameters that are reflecting the bargaining power positions for workers are theta and Z sub W, and for the firms are lambda Z sub F. And in equilibrium, we need to have like two equations and two unknowns. And so we equate we have this constant wage share that is W hat equal to P hat, and then we pin down the equilibrium markup, which is Z star, and C star is defined by a weighted sum of the respective bargaining power positions of workers and firms. And we just plug in the Z star in the P in the price inflation in equilibrium, and we get that this will be defined by the gap between these market power parameters, the Z sub F and minus Z sub W. And in this way, just think about that. Larger target markups and lambda values mean higher markup and inflation rates in equilibrium, because that would mean that the gap between Z sub F and Z sub W will be higher, and you get a higher rate of inflation in equilibrium. So yes, this is nothing to me that markup inflation. and you get higher markup inflation in equilibrium with higher bargaining position of firms. So we do have markup inflation in the post-Keynesian class conflict model. And we can even define a function of market power by firms, like a function of, well, the equilibrium inflation rate as a function of market power by firms that is expressed in this equation. Well, the market power by firms reflected in the values of lambda and z sub f are going to define the position and the slope of the p hat curve. And then if we assume proportional increments of lambda and p sub f, that those proportional increments mean higher bargaining power by firms, then we can define a function of equilibrium markup inflation in terms of the market power by firms, which will be positive. And if we assume proportional increments, then it will be decreasing. But you can think about like many shapes of that function, but it will be positive. And this can be complemented by contributions by Alfred Eigner, who said that the markup is an evolving variable. He has very institutional approach where it's affected by market power, target profits, entry barriers, antitrust policies, and many other institutional aspects. We also have this structuralist theory of inflation that distinguishes between basic inflationary pressures that are located in these supply side rigidities and bottlenecks in low price elasticity industries. And they also define these propagation mechanisms where we do have these power relationships, institutions, and economic policies. And some of the authors are Juan Oyola in Mexico, Osvaldo Zunkel, Chile. This is like a sort of Latin American tradition. And most recently, Lance Taylor and many others. And even very recently, the VIS edited a bulletin where I found this citation where they make a case for markup inflation. They say first pricing power as measured by the markup of prices over cost has increased to historical high. In a high inflation environment, higher markups could fuel inflation as businesses pay more attention to aggregate price growth and incorporate it into their pricing decisions. This could be one reason why inflationary pressures have broadened recently in sectors that were not directly hit by bottlenecks. That's why some sectors could be affected by these bottlenecks, but that doesn't mean that these sectors would be causing like this markup inflation. These bottlenecks can be translated to other sectors that would be the ones with the power to trigger this markup inflation spiral. And obviously, all these will have definite implications for the conduction of monetary policy, such as if there is a markup inflation, it means wage price spiral is a myth. It cannot be true. Like you cannot have both things at the same time. Then monetary policy would be highly ineffective or even counterproductive. Monetary policy tightening would aggravate the power imbalance between workers, firms, rentiers through the income distribution channel. This is a channel that, well, a very post-Keynesian channel where the main effect of monetary policy, that if there is an effect on aggregate demand, this would be through the changes in the income distribution between groups. And in this book, actually, in page 612, Mark says, it can be noted in particular that an increase in interest rates could lead to higher target costing margins and hence to lower real wage target for firms, higher markups, thus inducing a slower growth and faster inflation. So, yeah, and now we go to the empirical part where, yeah, there are some works that are there where, for example, Gonzalo and Luciani find evidence that market power is significantly correlated with huge increase in both markups and profit margins in 2021 in the US and UK. Similar findings for the Eurozone And Storm argues that this happened because not only several firms had to shut down due to the measures to contain the pandemic, increasing market concentration, but those surviving firms ended up in a privileged position to access input and foreign markets. And we start, well, with the traditional markup equation, where the rate of change in the markup is defined as the gap between the price inflation and the unit labor cost. And I took 7 industrialized or countries, and I just plotted here the markup rates, like computed with the GDP deflator and the CPI. And here's the inflation rate. This is in quarters in the, let's say, COVID inflation period from 2020 to 2022 Q1. And then we see that there is a clear pattern that they both go up as COVID develops. And I will argue that this relationship is not trivial, that this relationship is particular to the situation that we are experiencing right now. And I took, for example, the early 80s inflation period, because this kind of period, the late 70s, early 80s inflation period, was the only period comparable in terms of the magnitude of inflation in these industrialized countries. And what we see is this, that is completely different. Well, you don't see a clear pattern in terms of the markup, the rate of change in the markup. And in case here inflation is very high, although you do see that there is decrease, it is decreasing at some point from 1982. But actually, for example, if we take the US, we see that the inflation rate is going down, and even we have the markup rate going up. So it's the opposite relation that is happening during COVID. So I decided, okay, what if I run a fixed effects model? I like a very simple model, but sometimes simplicity gives you tractability, because you can see and the coefficients are more meaningful in that sense. You can interpret it better. These are just correlations that show that in the first row is the COVID inflation period. This the fitted lines are just it's the correlation, and it's positive. It's a positive slope, and in the early 80s period, it is negative, or it's not significant, because it's it cannot be probably this correlation is just given by these 2 observations. So there is no significant correlation in the early 80s, but in the COVID period is different. And then if you increase the number of industrialized countries, you get a more significant relationship between markup rates and inflation rates. And this is the results of the fixed effects regression, where there is the regression of price inflation, and the first coefficient is the rate of change in the markup, and it's for all the COVID periods, it's significant, and it persists after controlling for example, variables that could affect the measurement of this coefficient. For example, the workers' terms of trade, which is the difference between the GDP deflator and the CPI, labor productivity, for example. And for the 7 country group and for the 33 country group. And you see that there is this positive and significant relationship. And if you take the early 80s in the last column, you don't see that relationship. It's completely disappears. It disappears. And then however, you can see that the significance of this correlation is not really large if you compare average inflation rate that is depicted by the constant. So in this case, for the 7 country group, when you have just this correlation, a 1 percentage point increase in the markup would be related to a half percentage point increase in inflation rate. So it's significant, is positive, but perhaps it's not very large. And this is consistent with the story by Post-Keynesians that say, okay, if markup inflation is there, but it's not, perhaps not the only factor, and it's not perhaps the most important. This is just summarizing what I just told you. However, some new Keynesians have been arguing that what if markups are responding to tight markets and firms have reached full capacity? What if it is the fact that firms are they don't have, like, they are full capacity, or they just and markups are just reflecting this fact? So let's look at the numbers on capacity utilization. And unfortunately, I couldn't find like numbers for capacity utilization for the whole sample of countries, but I did find for Canada and the US in this for all these periods. And you see that capacity utilization in Canada, the first graph, is at historically low rates. I mean, it's not even at pre-COVID rates. And this is like 2022 Q1 when everybody was, inflation, run. And it's not like really large in terms of historical. Like, and in the case of the US, it's the same. It's not like particularly like high. There are no high. It's at 80%, where rates before the global financial crisis were above 80%. And even if we take the 70s and 80s, they were at 85%. So full capacity is not there. Capacity utilization, sorry. And I decided to run linear regressions where I added capacity to see if this capacity utilization would decrease my significance of the markup. And then we see that that's not the case for any specification. It's not related. And you see that for all the specifications, capacity, the coefficient associated to capacity utilization is not significant. And I did introduce interaction terms to see if the results here would coincide with the fixed effect model before. In this, what happened with the rate of change in the markup during the COVID inflation period and during the late 70s and early 80s inflation period. And they coincide. You see that for Canada, it is positive and significant. And for the US, it is positive and significant. And for the US, I only have data for the US like before the 1988, and it is negative and significant as at the beginning, the graph. So this is completely like this, this is completely consistent with the fixed effects model that I found. And something to notice, like the coefficients on the markup are significant for the US and negative. And you will say, why is that? But those coefficients are completely driven by the observations that happened before the 80s. Well, in the early 80s and the 70s and so on, not after, because if I just take the same period, the same period as in Canada, as in the US, the coefficient is the same. So we have the same kind of process. And it would be interesting to look at what happened before, like in the 70s and 80s, what happened with the relationship between rates of change in the markup and inflation. And in this period, can we talk about a wage price spiral or not, or is there something else? who knows? But here it might be an interesting question to address. But during COVID, yes, I mean, there are increasing number of evidence that pointing at markup inflation as a source of this general inflation. And then, yeah, well, this is just the results for the regression. And the conclusions of the general paper. So claims disregarding markup inflation are contradicted by an increasing number of evidence. Propagation mechanisms are hardly identified in wage price spirals, and it is the greater imbalance in power relations among social classes, economic actors that is like driving markup inflation. The rise in the power of firms and the lack of a countervailing power by workers has been one of the factors behind this COVID inflation. But there are other factors. And the markups, this rising markups does not respond to the supposedly tight economy. And in that conditions, monetary policy would not tackle any of these inflationary pressures nor propagation mechanisms. Some of the caveats of this paper is that the COVID inflation period is still underway, so perhaps future data will contradict or maybe say something else, or maybe support. Or the markup measure is that I use is just one among other measures of the markup, and you can also use profit margins and other things. And the countries considered are just industrialized countries, not developing countries. Thank you.